Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Stephanie Waller, and I am the Program Director at Grantmakers for Education. On behalf of the entire staff team at Grantmakers for Education, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Walking the Talk, How Foundations Can Use New Data to Better Fund Racial Equity and Justice. We're really excited to dig into today's conversation, and I do mean conversation, so we invite you throughout the webinar today to please engage, reflect, react in the chat. We'll be monitoring it, but please, share questions for our panel. In an era where new legislation is seemingly introduced daily to counter and stall racial equity efforts, where folks are trying to co-opt the term DEI as a proxy for a slur in order to undermine Black leadership, the work that the Schott Foundation has done with the Justice is the Foundation report comes at a critical time for our field. In this report, they both precisely name what we mean when we refer to racial equity and racial justice, and they also operationalize for us what it means both to fund and structure funding organizations to do the hard, meaningful, sustained racial equity and racial justice work that this moment calls for. We recognize that folks on the call today are coming from foundations of varying sizes and structures, as well as a range of perspectives and experiences related to racial equity and racial justice work. But if you are looking for colleagues with deep personal and professional engagement and investment in this work, you have absolutely come to the right place. We're honored to be joined by truly an all-star panel of experts to have this conversation. So I will not delay us any further. I'm happy to kick things over to Diana Tate Vermeire, Senior Vice President of Strategy at the Schott Foundation, who will ground us in the data and get us started, as well as introduce our panel. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good day to everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to spend time with us. I am so glad and honored to be part of this discussion and to have the opportunity to engage with the panelists on the Justice is the Foundation report. Before we jump in with the panelists, I do just want to take a moment to ground us in the data and what the report says. So first and foremost, the Schott Foundation for Public Education is a BIPOC-led fund that pools philanthropic funding and fuels racial and education justice movements. For more than 30 years, Schott has used data to inform our grant making, support our grantee partners, and collaborate with fellow funders to increase our collective impact. This project, Justice is the Foundation, assesses the K-12 philanthropic sector through a lens of racial equity and racial justice. We have worked with Candid, a center for nonprofit resources and tools, over the past 4 years to examine K-12 education philanthropy's grant-making priorities. Using their extensive grant database, we took a bird's eye view of the sector's priorities across time and geography. This is the third report in our partnership. Each has covered a 3-year span of grant data to ensure a more accurate picture and better capture multi-year grants. When you download the full action brief, you can see our methodology section to learn more. But this is just a quick snapshot of what it is that we use to guide our work, particularly the terms that we use: racial equity and racial justice. Racial equity grants address the achievement gap. Examples of that could include racial bias trainings for teachers or mentorship programs for Black and Brown students. Where racial inequity is present, racial equity grants work to address it. Racial justice grants, on the other hand, they are a subset of racial equity grants, but they address the underlying opportunity gaps and systems that generate racial inequity. They seek to address the root causes of inequities. So when we take a look at racial justice grants, they focus explicitly on empowering people closest to the problem to organize in their communities to change the systems that create and reinforce racial inequity in the first place. Racial justice grant making supports things like parent and youth organizing, building community power, and pursuing policy change, all in an effort to create systemic solutions to these systemic issues. If racial equity works to staunch the bleeding, racial justice works to heal the wound. It's clear that schools and communities across the country need more of both. So what did we find? Out of 18.9 billion from 2019 through 2021, K through 12 funders invested just over 14% of grants in racial equity work and only 0.3% in racial justice work. I'm going to say that again, only 0.3% in racial justice work. It's clear that especially now in US public schools, the majority of students are students of color. And it is clear that we collectively are not meeting the moment. We also found that what little dollars are invested in the work skews away from the regions with the most students of color. 43% of students of color attend schools in the South, yet just 25% of racial equity and 14% of racial justice grants are allocated there. The data also confirms what grassroots and racial justice organizations have been saying for a generation, that this isn't a new problem for the sector. The chart developed from a more limited data set intends to show here the broader sector-wide trends year by year. So you will notice that in 2015, the year after the police murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, there was the highest proportion of racial equity grant making over the past decade. It has trended downward ever since. This tells us that as a sector, we cannot afford another decade of underinvestment in racial equity and racial justice. Our children cannot afford it, our neighborhoods and communities cannot afford it, and our democracy cannot afford it. So what can we do here and now? Our panelists will have much more to say on this, but here are a few of the starting points and the ways that we've been thinking about it. It's time to transform our analysis, the way we do things. It's time to transform our organizational practices, and it's time to transform grant-making strategies and how we commit to the communities that we serve and how we ensure their sustainability. So having recapped a little bit of the report, it's now time to jump in and start a discussion with our fantastic panelists. We have joining us today Adaku Uta, Senior Manager of Movement Building Programs at Building Movement Projects, Dr. Gisele Shorter, President and CEO of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, and Dr. John Jackson, President and CEO of the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Thank you all for being here with us today and for jumping into this discussion. I'm going to start first with Adaku. I would love to hear from you not only about Building Movement Project, but really your new report on Black-led organizations, how the leaders you've interviewed navigated the past 4 years, and what are some of the common answers you received?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Diana. It's such a gift to get to be here with all of you. And thanks for the folks who showed up. This shares a commitment to racial justice in your own way. And I'm hopeful that the seeds that are planted here will get watered and implemented into the organizations that we do this work for. So again, my name is Adaku, and I work with the Building Movement Project. We're a national organization that works to strengthen the capacity of movement building organizations through developing research, convening nonprofit organizations to build really critical relationships, and we build really strategic resources to support how folks are able to build solidarity and build power in this time. And this past February, we released a report called Reckoning with Sustainability, which is part of an arc of reports that we've been doing around movement infrastructure, really studying, in particular for this report over the last 4 years, how have Black organizers who've been leading Black-led organizations really understood, how do they understand the 2020 racial reckoning moment? How have they shifted their strategies and practice to be able to extend the work of Black liberation into the future? And then what are some of the external threats that are happening and internal tensions that are happening within these organizations that are impacting the ways that Black-led organizations can build power in these times? And we had the immense honor of getting to interview 53 Black leaders all across the country, from national groups to local groups, and across issue areas. So definitely folks who represented the education justice realm, to folks doing abolition, health and healing justice, and climate and more. And so we really try to be as comprehensive as possible to get clear themes across different movement areas around how are Black leaders understanding this moment that we're in right now, preparing for the future, and figuring out how they might work together. And as we all know, 2020 was such a pivotal moment around racial reckoning that exposed a lot of entrenched disparities that so many of us, particularly for Black, Indigenous, and folks of color, have been navigating for quite some time. And as have a lot of these organizations have been doing for many, many years, they extended their commitment to doing this work despite the multiple ways that government betrayed our communities. And so a lot of community folks had to really, in a lot of ways, over-rely on nonprofit organizations to get access to healthcare, to get access to belonging in their community, to get access to a sense of safety, and all of that while also navigating the grief of mass death and also the grief of a number of Black folks at the hands of state-sanctioned violence. And many of the Black leaders that we talk to are strategists. So they have been studying the patterns of both our political conditions for quite some time, and had been in some ways prepared to meet the moment that was 2020, and in some ways we're not, but given the patterns of violence and also the patterns of attention that Black-led organizations were getting, specifically in 2020, attention funding really peaked towards Black-led organizations, especially Black-led organizations that were working around racial justice. And many organizations knew that attention was going to be short-lived, and folks would be whiplashing their commitments, their sincerity, and their desire to continue to do this work. And folks followed suit by really shifting their organizational infrastructure, whether that's expanding their staff or delaying how many staff that they were able to bring in based off of how they could forecast funding over the next couple of years. There were folks who had to shift when they did particular programming to really contend with the depth of exhaustion and fatigue that people are still navigating, to be honest. There are folks who made really strategic investments around land and making sure that the funding that they received would stretch further. So there's a gamut of things that I can talk more about, and I know we're going to get to it. And I want to pause here to bring in the wisdom of my my co-panelists to add to this conversation.
Thank you so much for that. And you're right, we're going to return to a couple of these pieces, but what is coming up for me and what you're sharing is just the ongoing need to prepare for this increased interest, but the fact that there's an awareness that the organizations themselves have to attend to the long-term sustainability of their folks to even do the work.
Yeah.
Super important, critical. Thank you so much for that. I want to turn now to Gisele, and I'm hoping that you can share a little bit with us about how racial equity and racial justice really fits into Nellie Mae's grant-making strategy, and how you and your grantee partners connect grassroots advocacy to the better academic and life outcomes of the communities that we're working to support.
Great. Well, thanks for asking that and having me and this platform to talk about the work. As the largest education justice funder in the country, we're focused on three things: building will and demand for the idea of education justice. I'm going to come back to that as an idea, as a construct. The second is supporting infrastructure or development of mechanisms at a hyperlocal community to state level, to regional, to national level, to interrogate who is least well served by our current system and what that means about how we then build will and demand as the first thing that we're doing to respond to what is found. And then the third, which really is the inside ball of philanthropy. And these lofty ideas of trust-based philanthropy have not actually borne fruit. And so I am committed to designing and creating a space where Nellie Mae becomes a proof point that philanthropy can be a space where deep investment in community and trust in community-based solutions and innovation can be met with impactful outcomes, because often folks put them as polar opposites, right? We can invest in community or we can get to impact, when in fact, I'd argue that we can do both and we have to do both. So if I think of that as what I am in service of, where the organization will continue to go, our strategy then shows up in 3 areas as well. We are prioritizing support to BIPOC, community-led, youth-focused, youth organizing to increase not only their impact, but their sustainability, with an eye toward a belief and a power reset to say community knows a set of things about where and how systems are exerting force. Doesn't always mean community is best positioned to solve the problem. So how do we actually create an ecosystem and a set of dynamic relationships to address those things? I think the second then is partnering with organizations in support of districts working to bridge build with community members and invest in evidence-based solutions and strategies, right? There's nothing in your graduate school, your certification, your principal superintendent training that actually gives you the kind of what does John Powell say, bridging, breaking, bonding skill set. They don't teach you that, right? And so how do we support again, the ecosystem around a system and system actors to effectively partner with diverse voices, diverse actors that are coming from community. And then the third is incentivizing policy coalitions and really leveraging the power of philanthropy to bring together grassroots and grasstops efforts to eliminate disparities and build will for the kinds of systems change that we know would relieve pressure and create the context for every child to thrive. You know, I don't know if I'm preaching to the choir and I've like now turned around and I'm in that stance, or if I'm offering some ideas to others. So I'm going to toggle. But when I think about building will for education justice, it is the provocative idea, and why it's still provocative 250 years into our democracy, I'm not sure. But the idea of a high quality education for every child, hard stop, period, right? When we say every child, I actually mean every child. If public education is the cornerstone of our democracy, and almost 250 years into this idea of the American democracy, we still have not realized that. We're 70 years into Brown, right? We are still debating for whom the public education system and for whom a high quality education should be afforded, and how that then connects to what is the government's responsibility, what is our responsibility as citizens, how our tax levy dollars are leveraged, right? So I think there is a role that Nellie Mae plays as a regional foundation, as distinct from national, as distinct from community-based, that stands on the balcony and says we can actually be a bridge builder, that we can support this demand building, this will building to actually afford a high quality public education to every child. I'll pause there and happy to talk through some specific ways that I'm thinking about and we are actually doing that.
Thank you, Gisele. Thank you so much for that. And raising the point about both the need to bring a collaborative approach, right? That the bringing all of the folks to the table to talk about the solutions, including in the various levers that individuals play or sectors actually play in the solutions. I'm going to turn to John now for a moment and really ask you, John, given what you've heard and how the conversation has gone thus far, how do you see Schott's racial justice grant making and public schools more broadly in the context of building a multiracial democracy?
Definitely. First, I just want to thank Nicole and Stephanie and our GFE family for making time for us to have this conversation and for me to share this moment with Gisele and Adaku to, again, have this critical conversation. I want to start first by setting the context of what public education is to this country, which leads to the conversation around who Schott funds and why we fund those that we fund, our grantee partners. First, I think it's clear that the public education system is the bedrock of our economy, the bedrock of our democracy. The public education system educates over 90% of those that are within the US student population. If you look at the list of the Fortune 500 CEOs, the majority of those are public education graduates. If you look at those who serve in our military, the majority of those men and women are public education graduates. If you walk into a hospital, the majority of those doctors and health professions are public education graduates. So it's important for us to affirm what the public education system is. It is the bedrock of many of our systems. That being said, to the point that Gisele raised, the public education system is also democracy at work. And too often we think about a democracy and we only think about elections. And you say, well, you don't elect a teacher, you don't elect a bus driver. But beyond an election, a democracy, a high functioning democracy has other critical components to it. For example, the continuous progress toward equitable inputs and outputs, access to truthful information. This is why pushing against book bans is critically important. Multiple points of access. This is why school boards are important and PTAs, and openly engage to all. And there isn't a come as you are, there isn't more of a come as you are system than our public education system, regardless of race, whether you're male, female, gender non-conforming, wealthy, homeless, what have you. Our public education system takes all and educates all. So in many respects, our public education system is already a multiracial democracy. And because democracies are about relationships, our grassroots organizations and those that we fund at the Schott Foundation, they are those individuals who ensure that our systems stay in good relationship to all students, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity. And like a relationship, it's not a destination. A relationship doesn't end at the point where you get married. Raising a child doesn't end at birth. So even beyond the birth of a nation, we need to have the infrastructure and those who are fighting to make sure that the system and the nation stays in good relationship with all of its people. And for us, that's why we fund grassroots BIPOC-led organization, because our history has proven our democracy has progress, racial equity and racial justice has progress when the infrastructure of those organizations at a local, state, and national level is strong enough to keep us in good relationship to all people.
Thank you for that, John. I'm really appreciating what all of you all are saying about centering the folks in the communities, making sure that it's relational, making sure that we're focused on ongoing sustainability and nurturing the work and the goals that we have for our communities and our democracy. Turning back to Adaku, I want to pick up on something that you started to allude to, which was thinking about the arc of funding, thinking about the experiences, thinking about the exhaustion that folks have been feeling because this work is long-term. It has been ongoing a very long time, not just a moment where the country may be reflected. This is the work that has been ever present. When you talked about interviewing these leaders, you talked a little bit about their preparation for the fact that it may just be a moment in the minds of others, that it may be limited, and that there may be a funding cliff that happened, that our report evidenced a sense of a continued decline. So after that surge, how do they act with that knowledge, and what should funders know about how these leaders see philanthropy, either with them or in the role of the work that they're doing?
Excellent question. So there are a number of different fractals of people, so that they were the folks who had experienced this whiplash of philanthropy over time, over the last decade, some over the last 2 decades, and knew that this was coming. They knew that this peak, this cliff would come, and then there would be a drop. And so for those folks, they really extended the life of the funds that they got, and lowered and slowed down how big the organization grew, whether that was in staff size, in strategic planning, in some of the land investments that they were able to make. And still they took the opportunity to grow. So there were folks who expanded the level of benefits, or people who were willing to experiment with different organizational infrastructure, like co-directorships, or having different kinds of departments that focus more heavily on programmatic pieces in order to build a bigger base of people, because there was such, there's been an increased interest of people who want to join a political home and engage in organizing. And so people who knew that the whiplash was coming, knew to grow in a really cautious way, and stretch their money in ways that would prepare them for a time like this, when that level of support would be retracted. And in fact, many of the folks who we talked to, even though they knew that the retraction was coming, did not realize that the retraction would come so soon. So some people expected maybe in the next 3 years, but actually that retraction started in 2022, for some people in 2021. And I also want to provide some context. Not all of the organizations were funded in the same way. So national organizations tended to get a lot more of the coin. Local organizations, particularly local organizations in the Midwest and the South, were often forgotten. And for some folks, didn't even see that level of support, and really had to rely on grassroots fundraising and funding from community members to support their work. So I think that that's important to note, that not everybody got access to the same amount of increase in funding and attention in the same way. Now there's the other fractal of folks who knew that the retraction was coming, but they did not have the resources or the financial management savvy to be able to plan well. And I would connects that fractal of folks to folks who didn't recognize that this kind of whiplash was coming. And so folks grew too fast, too soon. And, some of those organizations now are having to tend to, maybe even having to let go of staff, or shorten the size of the organization, because they cannot sustain the amount of money. They cannot bring in the same amount of money that they were bringing in 2021, 2022. And of course, that fundamentally impacts how people are able to organize. If you have less people to do the work, the quality and the kind of work that we're able to do and how far it can stretch is severely impacted. And when we think about some of the conditions that we're in right now, particularly impacting, not just the education justice space, but intersectionally across, where we're seeing impacts to bodily sovereignty, where we're seeing an increase of wars, climate catastrophe, all of these things that impact our abilities to learn and to be able to participate in a multiracial democracy. All of those things are impacted significantly when we don't have the depth of infrastructure, organizational infrastructure in our movement spaces to be able to support communities to the level that we have said that we want to do. And so for funders, the regardless of who we talked to and where people were from, the song was the same. So people, the level of trust of philanthropy is really, really low. And it doesn't come from fabrication or myth. It comes from real lived experience of how people have been treated over time. and the over-promising and the under-delivering, and how that consistently happens over and over and over again, even with the depth of relationships that organizations have chosen to keep building with foundations. And there's a real question here about who is philanthropy accountable to? Are you here for us, or are you here just for folks who have access to wealth? And I want to pull this quote from M. Adams, who's the co-executive director at Movement for Black Lives. And they say, you know, fund us like you want us to win. And the patterns of funding that are happening right now do not indicate
Right.
the foundation actually wants us to win. And so I think that that's something that we really need to wrestle with, about the depth of how much we're giving right now, and how much that actually either moves us closer to building collective power, or moves us away from that and is actually harming our organizations.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that is so powerful to talk about what is our true intention in the work that we do, because we want to win. And are we doing what we need to do to actually do that? Are we moving the monies in the way that we need to ensure that that success is achieved? I think I'll turn to Gisele now and sort of frame a little bit of that. You know, thinking about that, Gisele, I'm curious about where you see Nellie Mae and your grantees on the landscape today. So, are we funding to win? And we also know that the landscape has changed. So racial equity is under attack. So, you know, there's a question about, are we funding to win? And then it seems like the attacks are redoubled in this moment in time. So, you know, how is it that you all are thinking about enabling grantees to meet the urgent challenges in front of them, but also this theme that we have around sustainability and long term, and really investing in and ensuring that we're here to continue this work, you know, for decades?
So the short answer, the direct answer is no, we're not funded to win. And it's partly because I'm not sure that as education funders, we are clear on what winning means. If we are brutally honest, the calling in of trust-based philanthropy that a lot of folks got on board with was an explicit articulation of I do, you do, we do. And if we're not clear on the what is the we do, what is the shared vision, what winning is, what it means for every child, every community, to not just be thriving, but thriving on their own terms, I'm not sure then that we can honor the we do, the like philanthropy does. I have a very particular view on this, and I'll speak to that point. So, you know, I think as Adaku eloquently framed, we've been experiencing the compounded crisis, right? So it's a global pandemic, a rise in racist attacks, and continued violence against our communities. That's not new, but it has been an emboldening, right? And I think that's an important distinction, not new, but emboldened. Attacks on the democracy through the form and through the lens of attacks on the institution of public education, really calling into question, will we maintain and sustain this cornerstone of our democracy, right? That doesn't speak to any of the things that are happening at an interpersonal to inter-community set of dynamics around mental health, housing, workforce, all of the others, right? So if we're honest about what is the dynamic in which children are learning and growing, adults in the system are working and operating, we are all navigating as humans and humanity, we also then have to call out that we're headed into what is likely another year of increased and more aggressive attacks on the institution of public education and opportunities for all, right? We are seeing this debate play out in the public squares and in the public forum. When I think about the northern tier of New England, it is not new, it is not unique, but it is a particular pain point. We are seeing districts across Vermont struggle to pass their budgets. We are seeing folks gearing up to go into a ballot to a voting and have on the ballot in Maine whether or not they will increase their tax rate. will increase the amount that they pay for public education, particularly with the backdrop where in the Northern Tier, you have an aging populace, an aging largely white populace. You have resettlement, as in the feds are resettling new immigrant populations to those communities. You have gateway communities where the governor is placing new immigrants in a community. And so we are asking older, largely white, non-identified with or identifying with the new immigrant populations to pay more for a system on fixed income when they are clear their children, their grandchildren are never moving back to their community and to rural communities. So who should bear the brunt of that cost, right? And they think of, and we are watching the public narrative be quite violent about what is the cost of immigrants, what is the cost and to whom. And so I think there is a role that Nellie Mae will play, that education philanthropy can play, must play, because this isn't just about the democracy. This is actually about, at a human level and in community, how do we afford these rights and privileges as represented in our public education system to every child? I think there's also, in the I do stance, I'm running general operating support. I'm also then gearing up. We are Nellie Mae and the Schott Foundation, John and our teams are partnering to continue to strengthen the nonprofit, the youth community grassroots ecosystem with an eye towards sustainability. We hear from philanthropic principals, particularly in the family foundation setting, well, at what point will these organizations get to sustainability and not be over-reliant on philanthropy? I'm not sure when that would happen, but if we don't explicitly invest in them to get to a level of sustainability in the way that we have with most of the large national white-led organizations, it did not happen on a short time horizon. It did not happen without deep and significant investment. If we don't do that for the community-rooted, the BIPOC, POC-led, if we do not do that for the youth organizing, the advocacy, then they will not get to sustainability. And they will not be the kind of partners that superintendents and chiefs increasingly realize. And they realize this through COVID. Community stepped in the gap when the systems closed. When schools closed their doors, where did kids go? It was that nonprofit ecosystem, largely led by BIPOC, hyperlocal grassroots, that stepped in and pivoted and scaffolded and put their arms around families, put their arms around children, put their arms around those that needed, because they knew, they understand, and there was no judgment there. So I see that happening with many of my grantees. You know, I would call out folks like Devin, right, in Boston, the Teachers Lounge has made tremendous strides in diversifying not only the education workforce through recruitment, revitalization, and the retaining of educators of color, but there is a significant spillover effect for all educators in the market. You know, in New Haven and Providence, there's deeper partnership led by districts because we've been pouring in and supporting the in-system folks to partner effectively with community without judgment, to pivot and co-share, co-brand, co-design, wield power, share power in productive ways. And then in Massachusetts, you know, watching and seeing the passage of the Student Opportunity Act and Fair Share Amendment, that's resulted in millions of new dollars in investments that have advanced not only racial and economic justice within the state, but it has a clear connection to student level outcomes. And I think we're seeing an overall expansion. National funders have been stepping in and have been great partners in Vermont, in New Hampshire, as an offset over these last 4 years to a violent pendulum swinging in opposition to culturally inclusive and responsive curriculum. We could be doubling down there. And I think that's part of what in the I do philanthropy could be doing.
Thank you so much for that, Gisele. I mean, I really appreciate the contextualization of the challenges on the local level with the communities that are being relied on to fund through our normal systems, while failing to really fund the folks, as you so aptly put it, you know, in the moment of COVID, pivoted and embraced communities in the ways that we want to see, in the ways we want to operate when we challenge ourselves in the world that we want to see. So turning now quickly to John, and thinking about all of that has been shared in this dialogue, I want to also turn us back a little bit to the data of the report. Justice is the foundation, that is supported by the conversation we've had. It makes clear that the data, that the sector needs to be making bold moves. Gisele, Adaku have challenged us. There needs to be a change in how we operate if we're really going to close these opportunity gaps and make racial justice, racial equity a reality. So you get to answer a question in this space. What are some of the things that funders can do differently? How can those who are watching today start to think about these challenging conversations in their own organizations to even start to lead them and change some of the dynamic?
Yeah, I think first it takes an acknowledgement that all of our issues, many of the issues that we fund are connected. This concept around I only fund health and wellness, I only fund education, I only fund democracy work. Our young people live in a ecosystem that impacts all of those areas, impact them in different ways. So we have to do what we often asked our grantee partners to do: collaborate more. That's why Nellie Mae and the Schott Foundation and others are coming together to sort of collaborate to yield a larger impact. The challenge that we're up against is that for a number of decades, there are those who believed in democracy, a democracy that's led by the people, led by the majority, when the majority looked like them. And the question that remains now is, will individuals believe in a democracy where the majority no longer looks like them? And this is part of the tension. And our public education system as democracy at work, where the majority of students now are students of color, it's already proven that a multiracial democracy can work. So that's why we see this battle that exists in this targeting of the public education system. So this is not a new battle. This has happened for decades to centuries. This is happening today. This will happen tomorrow. So as we think about how we fund our organizations, we have to fund them for the long term. We have to fund them, give them enough fuel for the journey. And the journey doesn't have a destination because it's a part of a process. And that could happen in a number of ways. There's a taxonomy of effective ways in which we can make deeper investments in racial justice organization, moving from 1 year to 2 years of commitments to 5 to 10. And this should not be awkward to us, because many of us, when we manage our endowments, we pull in and we engage asset managers, and we don't give them 1 year of funding and say, make a miracle. We give them funding and we measure their progress 3, 5, 10 years down the road. We have to make the same commitment with our racial justice partners, so they're not forced to do what Adaku talked about, try to overpromise, in many respects, in some cases under-deliver, although I will say that their track record of doing more with less is strong enough that we should be giving them more to do more with. So we got to make deeper, longer-term commitments. And we can also, understanding the sector knows the value of endowments, we should also consider endowing many of these organizations. And this is something that at the Schott Foundation, we have really worked through our Endow Now campaign with a number of philanthropic partners to change the behavior of not even considering supporting endowments within our overall grant-making portfolio. And we've sort of walked into that value of endowing organizations by launching a $30 million racial justice and education campaign, where we're seeking to endow 3 national racial justice organizations over the next 5 years. And Nellie Mae Foundation is a contributor to that endowment, Skillman Foundation, and others. Because ultimately, it's not just about today. And I think you all have heard that consistently in this discussion. but we've got to give the organizations, we've got to invest in such a way where we can fight the battles today and provide the sustainability and what the sustainability necessary to strategize for the future.
Thank you for that, John. I think, this thread continues to come up, sustainability, long-term, the relational aspect of this. It's so important if we're really going to see the change that we want to see. I'd invite that we all maybe can put all of our panelists on the screen as we move in towards the end of our time together, to also give us an opportunity to engage with one another. But Adaku, I'm going to come back to you, because John's point about the need for this sustainability and what philanthropy needs to do, I'm wondering if you could share even more, reflecting on your work. Organizers need a robust system, movement ecosystem. They need the support. Do you have offerings for us about what that looks like in practice? What it is that we need to do to create the ecosystem to support the leaders that you've been sharing with us in terms of the work that you do?
Absolutely. And I want to echo some of what Dr. Jackson just offered around our ecosystem. So not one strategy alone, not one organization alone is going to transform the generational conditions that we're in. We need collaboration, we need solidarity, we need interdependence. And how an ecosystem functions within the movement landscape and also within nature is that there is interdependence happening that is less reliant on competition and comparison, which often can be heightened and created from funders because of the way funders choose to fund, sometimes the ways that funders gatekeep funding, or even seek out recommendations of who to fund from their grantees, which can put grantees in a pretty awkward position. And so when we think about movement ecosystem, we think about building the bigger we that is working together towards transforming our conditions for a shared purpose, whether it's around justice, equity, or liberation. And that work is hard. That is work that takes a lot of risk, it takes a lot of resource, and it takes a lot of relationships. And not all organizations currently have the skill or the level of resource necessary to be able to build that ecosystem. So I think a big piece that we're also seeing that also was requested for by a lot of the folks that we interviewed was more funding to support capacity building around leadership development, around organizational development. Black leaders are really clear about what it is that they need for their organizations to survive and to thrive into the future. And some of that is, yes, giving general operating dollars that is flexible and is multi-year. And it's also being a part of creating spaces, co-creating spaces led by organizing organizations that really center relationship building, that really center us building our skills. The moment that we're in requires a new set of skills, and our skills really have to keep developing over time. We can't keep using the same skills that we've used 10 years ago. I mean, some of them, yes, might be supportive, but we have to keep adapting and growing and becoming even more competent to be able to meet the pressure and the flavor of chaos that we're in this moment. And a lot of organizers and also organizations are desiring more capacity development to be able to resource their staff to be able to deal with these conditions, and also spaces for reflection. I mean, we're constantly, many of the folks we talk to are inside of campaigns that have had really significant wins, and some of these wins can be taken to scale. I think of some of the defund strategies that were implemented, say here in New York, where we were able to reinvest some money that was going into funding police and bringing that back into education, taking that to scale, not just within the sphere of New York, but across the country. So how could we take some time to harvest the lessons from these huge wins that are happening locally, regionally, even nationally, so that we can expand them to scale. So when I think of movement ecosystem, I think of strengthening the relationships, strengthening the strategies, and also strengthening the trust that's necessary for folks to be able to have relationships over time to move towards shared purpose together.
Thank you for that. It's so important to think about what we're creating, and it leads me to think a little bit more. Gisele, you shared and were clear. Nellie Mae is regionally focused, so it's distinct from a national. And you're hearing the needs for ecosystem. You're hearing the needs for supporting community and scaling. Right? Lessons learned. John, you made the point about collaboration. I'm curious, Gisele, from your perspective as a regional funder and listening to this dialogue, what are some of the either benefits or opportunities or even the challenges with the place-based approach and thinking about achieving racial equity, racial justice in this work?
I think there are two that I feel most acutely. And 6 years into philanthropy, having transitioned from a family foundation, a national family foundation, to a regional foundation with our own corpus and access to a partnership with an investment committee of the board, not a family or separate entity. I think there are two. The first is our ability to table set is only as good as our credibility as a partner to a diverse constituency. The states, there are 6 states of New England. Within each state, they are so vastly different, right? So how do we actually maintain deep intimacy and partnership, authentic partnership with corporate interest, with hyperlocal family interest, with student interest, with educators, with the workforce? That's a lot of complexity and nuance to hold and be authentic in. And so this is something that I and my team, 8 months in, we're grappling with. Where are we credible? What does it mean to be unapologetically in service of education justice? Every child deserves, should have access to not only a high quality education, but an education that helps them live their authentic lives. The first doxing that we had under my tenure is a week in Bangor, Maine. The district, the local community was excited to have received support in defense, right? And so Nellie Mae issued a limited RFP for 2 districts, 2 community-based organizations during a period where LGBTQ questioning young people were explicitly under attack, right? We started to receive requests as a backdoor to a FOIL request to the district about who funded them to receive or engage diverse students. And it was affinity spaces for all kids, and kids got to self-select. Who funded that? What was the selection? Can we get the names of who participated in what, right? So there are forces that are attempting to out, and I don't just mean out in a particular way. I mean out 360, a set of values that we don't hold dear, and I'm not sure that enough of us in ed philanthropy are leading with our values. The second is, how do we hold ourselves accountable? This is something I am personally grappling with. How do we hold ourselves accountable to, again, the I do, we do, you do? Because it's not enough to just, as John said, give it is a powerful thing to give the Gen Op support. And in fact, we could be giving more Gen Op support. And the question, if we at Nellie Mae are seed or anchor funders to the local, hyperlocal work, what does it mean to stage them for second phase funding? What does it mean to help these organizations, because it's in their own desire, not my desire for them, but their own desire to build the kind of qualitative, quantitative data set that positions them for procurement with the school districts, right? philanthropy did that for other organizations. How do we think about in this moment, the calling into our partners in philanthropy to say, it's time to do that with diverse and community, right? So those are the two things that I am grappling with and trying to solve for.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your honesty in what the challenges really are, and to this point about new skill sets and shifting. The dynamics are changing even as we look long term. We're nearing our time together, but I do have one final question that I would like to pose. John or Gisele, maybe you can think about this, even Adaku, if you have some thoughts on it. How do we get philanthropy to shift its priorities in that relational sense, in that one-on-one sense? I'm just wondering if any of you could share what it might look like, either a conversation, a challenging conversation, a dialogue, something that you've done to try to really shift the dynamic, help make movement in those relationships, in those one-on-one moments that we think we can build upon at scale, if possible, to really see the ultimate larger scale shift.
Yeah, I think it goes to something that Gisele just said. As a philanthropy and as a sector, we have to really lean into our values. The definition of philanthropy is love for humanity. And we've got to accept that in communities across this country, there are young people who receive more or less love based on their race or ethnicity. 250 years, close to 250 years after the founding of this country. And as a philanthropy walking into our values, what are we going to do about that? So a conversation that I had was one with Gail Christopher. And Gail simply said that racism is nothing more than institutionalized lovelessness. So in that respect, this is about building loving systems. And it's not just about education. And it's funny when funders say, well, I support democracy, I fund democracy, but I don't fund education. Well, education is democracy at work. I fund education, but I don't fund housing. Well, housing is an education issue. Transportation is an education issue. And we've got to see all of these issues being connected. And ultimately, our goal is to build the loving systems necessary so that all young people, regardless of where they're located, will have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn and to thrive.
Thank you for that, John. I appreciate that story, and talking about the need to really engage deeply, and that bringing us back to love is actually what we need to be focusing on. How do we change the systems to really embrace and pull everyone in and take care of our communities directly? We are at time, so I want to thank each of you for your wisdom and your authenticity in this moment and sharing your perspectives and the challenges that face philanthropy, but the opportunities we really have to do things differently and to hopefully see a different report several years from now about where we are going as a sector, but most importantly, as a community. So thank you all. Deep gratitude and appreciation for today's dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again to all of you for joining us, to each of our speakers. There's a lot swirling in my mind right now that I heard in the conversation just around who is philanthropy accountable to, funding like you want us to win, and really coalescing around what winning looks like. The opposition feels very clear on what winning is to them. And so how can we mobilize as a sector around what winning looks like to us? And then thinking about the ecosystem mindset, the fact that young people don't experience life or oppression in silos. They are in families with identities that are complex, trying to go to school in the midst of everything around them. So deep, deep, deep appreciation and gratitude to Adaku, Dr. Gisele, Dr. John, and Diana for the conversation today. I just want to close out with a couple of very quick announcements. The slides that were shared today, as well as the recording from this webinar, will be available in about a week on our YouTube channel. We'll also post them to the event page on our website. We love to stay connected to folks, so please feel free to use the QR codes to stay connected to us. There's also a preview of some upcoming programming throughout the month of April. So we hope to see you again soon, and thank you so much again for joining us.